So this is a great quote from St. Irenaeus: "The glory of God is a person fully alive." And ultimately, of course, that means the person fully alive in Christ. But what we're talking about today is very much about that journey that all of us have to go through of helping one another and ourselves be who God created us to be. So I'd like to begin here by presenting the basic focus of our time together. This is a two-part series based upon a book that I co-wrote, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, but the book is called Unrepeatable: Cultivating the Unique Calling of Every Person. And a part of that book is drawing out the story of another person and the great blessings of that. So we're going to talk about that today. And then later on in July, we have another session as well, which we'll talk about a bit later. So I'm Joshua here, and I did my best to squish this image so I didn't look too elongated or too fat, which is hard for me because I've always been thin. But in any case, hope the picture does justice. So I'm Joshua, and a couple of just biographical comments, really from a long history of being very interested in the human person. When I was a kid, I loved biographies, and I come from a family where my grandfather and my father were very much about what does it mean to understand the uniqueness of another human person and to draw that out so that the person as unique can flourish. So I've really been a lifelong student of the human person, and have a master's degree from Franciscan University in philosophy of the human person, and then got a degree, a PhD in philosophy of the human person from Duquesne University there in lovely Pittsburgh. So the human person, the flourishing of the human person, is really a big part of what God has called me to. I'm a co-developer of MCORE, which I think a lot of you know about, and this is a narrative-based assessment of unique innate motivation. And then about a year and a half ago, co-founded Inscape. And Inscape is a term from the great Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, and it refers to the unique essence of a thing, of a being. And we are about helping each person flourish in their unique personal vocation with Inscape. So I founded that with my co-author, Luke Burgis, who worked with me to write this book. I am the spouse to my lovely wife, Brooke, and we're the father of 6 children. Live not far from you all, near Steubenville, Ohio. So a bit of biographical information. Now, as I'm going along, please feel free to chat a question or raise your hand, and I'd be happy to respond as we go along. So what we're going to talk about, as I said, is the blessings of story. I'm going to go for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to have a question and answer session. And if things go as Karen and I talked about beforehand, I think you'll be muted largely for now. But if you do have a question, please feel free to chat. And that's how we'll proceed with our conversation today. All right, so we did the opening prayer. And we're going to have 4 basic points. The first thing I wanted to speak about is the profound gift of empathic listening, which is so foundational for our coaching work. I know it's very foundational for the work of the Human Formation Coalition, and it's a big part of what we talk about in our book. So that's first. And then we're going to talk about listening with empathy to achievement story and why that kind of story is so powerful in our work to cultivate the flourishing of other people. At that point, we're going to talk about the manifold blessing of listening to client achievement story. And this is a great blessing for the coachee or the mentee or our children, our loved ones. It's a great blessing for them. It's a blessing for us as coaches. But also, it really, really blesses the dynamic of the coaching relationship as well. So we're going to talk about that. And then I'm going to close with talking about the value of achievement story for integrating insights from the assessments that I know you all use, StrengthsFinder, MCORE, and APEST. So let's proceed here. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran theologian and pastor who wrote during the first part of the last century, and he died as a Christian martyr in the concentration camps. Or no, he was executed by Hitler. But he wrote a powerful book, The Cost of Discipleship. Just a lot of lessons for us as Christians. This is what Bonhoeffer says about loving our neighbor as Christ loved. The first service that one owes to others in the fellowship consists in listening to them. Just as love for God begins with listening to his word, so the beginning of love for the brethren is learning to listen. And that's really a first step I want to take here. And that is that as we love one another as Christ loved us, we listen to them. And this is something that today I think we're particularly starved of in our digital culture. I'm going to talk about that more in a session in July. But the markers for empathy among our young people are 40% less in this generation than they were in previous generations, because we've become so digitally attached and so removed from real conversation with one another that we're forgetting how to listen with empathy. And frankly, this is a real crisis, I think, in our culture right now, and a crisis of relationship. So I want to emphasize it. Now, we talk about listening with empathy, and I'd like to discuss really what that means. The first thing is that there's a twofold movement that takes place in empathy, a twofold transcendence of ourselves in an act of sacrificial love. The first thing that we do in empathy is in a way that it's very, very much involves our own self-possession, strength of self. We reach out towards the other. And the only way that we can effectively reach out towards the other is if we're strong in ourselves. So some people think of listening with empathy as a kind of soft and a kind of soft deference to the other person. And it is deference to the other person, but it requires a real strength of self to do this, right? So we reach out to the other in a moment of transcendence. And when we do that, when we reach out to the other, we open space for the other in ourselves. So that's the other movement, is that we open up interior space in ourselves for the other as we actively reach out to that person. And then we focus upon that person deeply with both sides of our brain, in one sense, right? We're listening to the logic of the words, right? The exact meaning of what they say. But we also listen with our imagination, with our intuition, with our heart. And that provides space for us to receive the feeling of the other, right? Those realities of the other that are not exactly said in the logic of their words. So when we listen with empathy, we're providing space for the other in our own selves. And this allows for deep understanding. The thoughts and the feelings of the other, we see from and feel from their perspective. And this is only possible if we reach out to them with great intention and open space for ourselves. So empathy is really a kind of sacrificial love. It's a kind of self-sacrifice, because we attend to the other, we turn off our own desire to speak, our own desire to control perhaps, our own desire to shape directly in one sense, and we open up a rich soil. If you think of it this way, we're opening up rich soil in ourselves where the other can take root, really. And this is the value and the profound depth of empathy, is that we're opening up interior space. The other can see that we're listening, can feel the beauty and the love and the warmth of it. And in that space, literally can take root in who they're uniquely called to be and to grow. Hopefully that's not too poetic and too abstract, but there's something very profound about empathy in that when we provide it for the other, imagine it this way. It's almost like also a kind of light and warmth that we shed on the other. And if you can think of them like a little sapling, in the light and warmth of our empathic listening, they can take root and grow and be deeply affirmed for who they are uniquely. So it's very profound stance that we have for other human persons. Now, I want to continue a conversation with you about the gift of empathic listening in the context of achievement story. So what is an achievement story, first of all? Well, it's a story of an activity that another person enjoyed doing and believed that he or she did well. Very simply that. And it doesn't have to be a story of some grand success in contemporary terms. It doesn't have to be a story of a person getting a strong GPA or meeting a sales quota or reaching success again according to what typically our culture would say is successful. But really any activity from any time of life or any sphere of activity that the person just loved to do, enjoyed doing, and believed they did well. So that's what we mean by achievement story. Now, it's fascinating to me as a coach, as somebody who's been working with achievement stories really ever since high school. I graduated high school in 1990. So felt called to this work for years and years. But it's remarkable to me that so many of the clients that I've worked with over the last several years have never been asked this kind of a story. So in my work with MCORE, I asked people to jot down achievement stories. And then, of course, I interview them on the basis of that, usually. And most of them have never taken the time to really reflect deeply on stories of these kinds of activities. Nor have they taken the time to reflect upon them, nor have they been deeply listened to as they shared achievement stories. So why this kind of story? Well, oftentimes if we're getting to know another person, we'll say, hey, tell me your story. And oftentimes in our culture, what we share about is family of origin, where we come from, place as well. It might be from Tennessee, might be from Boston. And we often begin to share with other people about those kind of general aspects of who we are, right? What we do for work, for example. Yeah, I'm an engineer, I'm an attorney, etc. So we often share at that broad general level with one another as we're sharing ourselves. Or we talk about things that we have in common. That's very typical also. So if we recognize that we're Steelers fans, right, that provides a quick connection that we can all talk about, right? And that's a good thing. And I'm not dismissing the value of that kind of story or stories what we have in common. But those are our go-to stories. And it's not typical for us to talk about activities in life where we had this deep sense of joy in doing something that we thought we did well and enjoyed doing. So why this kind of story? Why this kind of story for the value of coaching, for blessing a coach, for blessing the coaching relationship? And it's really this, that as people share story of being deeply engaged in activity that they enjoy doing, they believe they're doing well, they reveal their unique essence in a deep way. And it's because they share story of being deeply engaged in action. And these achievement stories present the person in a kind of flow, being in the zone. Those are a couple of words that we also use to describe what happens and people are in this kind of action. And when people are deeply engaged in action that they love, they almost forget about themselves, right? They forget about time. They forget, ironically, about their own self-concerns often. So this is not narcissistic navel-gazing here. It's about being engaged in action. And oftentimes, ironically, again, the self is a bit forgotten. But when we catch people in these moments of revealing themselves in this kind of action, it gets at their essence. So, for example, a story of a child who has been deeply, deeply engaged in writing a story or painting a picture or something like that. When we see them from the outside, immersed, absorbed in this kind of activity, we see it from the outside as a beautiful thing. But when we get access to their interior life, as they describe what they're doing, it's just a privileged place of access. So as people share then their achievement story in a context where a coach is listening with empathy and looking at what they're doing from their own perspective, feeling what they're doing from that perspective of being engaged in action that they love. This is where the empathy is particularly powerful, because we're empathizing with a person when they're at their best, when they are loving what they're doing, when they reveal themselves deeply. So, of course, it's possible to listen with empathy to all kinds of different stories. A person might share a moment of pain, a moment of loss, a moment of dealing with their own addiction, for example, and coming out of that. And it's very, very valuable for us to listen to people as they share that healing or that vulnerability or that loss that they've experienced. And of course, that's very, very powerful, particularly from a counseling standpoint, and just from the standpoint of showing love. It's valuable to listen with empathy to a person as they share about their family of origin or where they come from, or stories about their culture and their people. But as people share stories of being immersed in this action where they reveal themselves deeply, as we receive that from empathy, what happens is the soil of our own hearts, our own interior, as they recognize that they are affirmed and they're valued and that they're seen and loved in their particular uniqueness, it's a very, very powerful moment of empathy, because then who they are as unique persons, they recognize that that's beautiful, that it's good, that it's valuable, it's worth pursuing. And so this is why listening with empathy to the achievement story of another person is a kind of magical moment. And particularly if they've never really been listened to much as they share their story, or they've never been affirmed in their uniqueness also. So, brief summary: listening with empathy is profound. And we're culturally starved for that. We're often individually starved for that. And then when we listen with empathy to another person's achievement story, magic. It's awesome. So let's talk about the profound blessing that is at multiple levels. Okay. First of all here, as people recognize that another person, the coach in this case, is listening and truly gets who they are, that's affirming in multiple ways. Oftentimes, people have never been affirmed in their particular uniqueness. So when they are affirmed in that, they are blessed in their uniqueness. And what it tends to do is it tends to cultivate that. Again, it's like providing sun and the right kind of rain and the right kind of soil so that they recognize, wow, this is a great thing. And in the listening heart of another person, recognize I can do more of that. Okay. Another great thing that happens in empathic listening to achievement story is that the person isn't simply hearkening back to something that they did. That's true. But the thing about memory is that it's literally represented. So what will often happen as a person shares achievement story is that the same kind of positive endorphins that they experienced when they actually did the activity are relived. And so we're allowing a joyful memory to be almost represented. And that is why oftentimes people will grin from ear to ear. They will get giddy. They will get excited. Their eyes will open up and glisten. And they might often shed tears of various kinds, tears of something difficult that was worked through with a positive end, tears of joy. And again, because that's happening in the context of another loving person, giving the loving look, as Pope Francis talks about, it's again deeply affirming. So we're allowing people to relive joyful experiences, and that's very, very powerful. Now, as they share their stories of achievement, they're growing in self-awareness, particularly if you share multiple achievement stories. They begin to make connections between what they did at age 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, that the same kinds of patterns of uniqueness that emerge in those stories are represented in various episodes of various activities. So oftentimes you get aha moments or wow moments where they begin to see again the depth and beauty of their own unique selves. So blessings to the coachee. Also blessing to the coach. In our rapid fire age, where we have multiple connections through digital media, it's important for us to be able to get to know people quickly and authentically. So when a client shares his or her achievement story and we're listening with empathy, we get to know them quicker. And this provides a context then where we can make effective adjustment to the coachee. So for example, if a person's uniquely motivated to overcome obstacles and they have a whole history of steering into great difficulty to overcome those for the sake of the fruit of overcoming the great difficulty, it's important for the coach to know that, because they may approach the whole coaching relationship in a way that's flavored with overcoming great difficulty. Or it may be that you'd learn that the coachee is deeply, deeply interested in close participation because all their stories show them wanting to have very close relational connection. Well, if you know that as a coach, then you'll know that you may need to be particularly sensitive to their relational needs. Right? So it enables us to adjust quickly to the pace and the needs, the concerns, the interests of the coachee. Also blesses the coaching relationship. So when you're listening to another with empathy as they share the golden moment of an achievement story, rapport is very quickly developed. Right? So that's a great blessing. Also, in any strong coaching relationship, you're going to deal with areas of ineffectiveness with the other person, oftentimes areas of pain or areas of shadow side. And we understand shadow side by the flip side of a unique motivational gift. So because of the positivity of the listening closely with empathy to achievement story, there's a positive vibe, a positive context then for dealing with some of the painful stuff, the difficult stuff. But by leveraging that positivity and understanding the gift that they have and that they are through drawing out achievement story, then you have a good positive context for addressing some of those shadow side issues. Okay, now I want to go for about another 5 minutes here and just open things up for questions. But a critical part of Human Formation Coalition, of course, is the use of StrengthsFinder as well as MCORE and APEST also. So I know many of you have been trained in all three assessments. And if you've not been yet trained in all three of them, I think a lot of you will be. But one of the challenges is showing how the insights from all three of those assessments can be integrated together. Right? So if you know that somebody is got connectedness in their strengths finder, and you know that they're motivated around making an impact, and you know that they are, let's say, shepherd, for example, and they score high in that aspect of the APEST. How do these pull together? How do we understand them alongside one another? Well, it is possible, of course, to make those connections on the basis of the terms themselves. For example, if somebody has got connectedness as a strength, and you know that they are about making an impact motivationally, you can say, well, the person's strength or natural talent around connectedness is for the sake of making a profound impact, right? That's the fundamental motivational why. They're longing to make an impact, and they bring a certain strength to bear, connectedness, in order to make that happen. From a ministry role of particularly being a shepherd. So it's possible to draw those connections that way, of course, and there's value there. But what story can do is provide a vivid example of the person in action from their own life, where all those different insights are pulled together in one narrative context. And as people express a story where all three insights are present, and they express it in a holistic way where you see the essence of that person in action, what happens there is that the story provides a means for you to illustrate the different insights, and again, and how they pull together. So, for example, you may have a priest who just loves the relational ministry of sharing a meal with his parishioners, and then in the context of that meal, pulling people together who might not know one another. And so let's say that the priest talks about a story of building Alpha into his parish. Alpha, this program where people get basic catechesis in the Christian faith. They share a meal together. So let's say a priest brings Alpha into his parish and just loves to talk about how that happened and how the people are pulling together relationally. Well, that provides a context for the priest's strengths to be illustrated, right? So the connectedness of again, pulling people together to make the thing happen in the context of an Alpha event, introducing people to one another, helping one to see the value of another that they perhaps hadn't seen, and building close relational unity. But you also see, as this priest talks about what he loved about Alpha, that he's shaping the parish, shaping the lives of people who are present, and doing so in a way that allows him to be a great shepherd in that context. So story can integrate those results together very, very well, and then help people to see the connections. So I've talked a lot, and I don't like to talk a lot without a dialogue. So I'm going to shut up at this point and allow you all to just make comment or ask a question. And I'm happy to share more. One thing, let me just go over these slides before I forget, because I'm want to do that. I'm sharing with you from this book that I co-wrote called Unrepeatable. And we've got a whole chapter there on our unique motivational design. And we talk about story in that context. And then there's another whole chapter on mentoring with empathy also. And my co-author is Luke Burgis, who is the entrepreneur in residence at Catholic University of America. We wrote this book for mentors primarily. And we think about mentors in the large sense of coaches, pastors, counselors, parents, teachers. But interestingly, the very first person to read the book from cover to cover was a 15-year-old girl, very precocious 15-year-old, who is a family friend. And she probably read it cover to cover because she was looking for stories of her friends, my children. But in any case, we have found it very useful also for young people and those who are being mentored. And then finally, before I get to questions, this workbook that I note on the side here is an accompanying tool for the book itself, and it can be read by an individual simply going through the book itself as an accompanying tool. It's got all kinds of exercises that are about deepening the insights from the book, hopefully insights. But we also wrote it for facilitators, for mentors who are teaching classes or doing Bible studies or book studies, running youth groups, teaching catechesis. So any facilitator who's interested in cultivating the personal vocation of others. So the workbook's for that. All right, so that's my plug. And you can get the book and workbook at our website, unrepeatablelife.com. All right, enough about that. Questions and answers. And as a coach, I'm comfortable in silence, so I'll just sit here and wait for somebody to ask.
Josh, you said, Joe Killian here, you said that it is effective with younger individuals. I've had somewhat mixed results with, not necessarily with the motivational stories. I think this is the beauty of what you're doing and what the book is about, is I've actually had mixed results in working with youngsters, teenagers, in regards to identifying their strengths and them having a feel for what that's, what their strengths are really about. And yet with the story, it seems to me that everybody has some degree of story, but you don't always have that coming out clearly at the beginning. Is that correct? It may take some digging sometimes.
When you say take some digging, what do you mean by that?
Well, just that you'll need to spend some time. Some people will tell you, I haven't achieved much in my life. I mean, you talk about that in the book and in the training that we went through for MCORE coaching. But it is a challenge at times with some people because they don't define their lives that way.
That's true. That's very true.
Comment on that for not just necessarily just young people, but for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. We have debated about the value of referring to these kinds of stories of activity that people enjoy doing, believe they did well. We've debated about whether we should call those achievement stories, because sometimes when people hear the word achievement, they immediately think of contemporary success, gold stars, top of the class, winning races, et cetera, that kind of thing. And so sometimes people, they see the word achievement and they back away from it and they say, as you just suggested, Joe, I don't have any achievement stories. But for various reasons, we have stayed with achievement story, partly because we want people to know that they are a one of a kind, that they do have achievements, that they do have gifts to bring that have never been given and never will be given. And you're right, it does sometimes take a bit of digging out, but I've never had a situation in 25 plus years of working with people where I wasn't able to draw out some kind of story. So if there are situations where people say, hey, I ain't got nothing, I don't have any achievement stories, then what I'll do is say, well, let's just talk about something that you like to do. And usually that will open stuff up. And if people say, oh, like to do, then I might say, well, look, if you had all the time and money in the world. And you didn't have to worry about a job or pressure, and you could just go do something interesting, what would you do? And that will perk something up oftentimes. Or another way to get at achievement story is to ask people about their heroes. And this is something that's been proven to work well from a psychological research standpoint. There's something about being attracted to heroes who have something that we have, but at an elevated level. There's a kind of innate recognition in the hero that we identify in some way with them, even though we might not be able to articulate exactly what that is. So we have there's a guy at Wartburg College who's an MCORE coach, TJ Warren, who uses the hero story as a way to draw this out. But those are three ways that we get people to start talking about what they're drawn towards. And as people start to talk about what they're drawn towards, let's say, for example, a kid says, well, if I had all the time in the world, I might go and travel the Grand Canyon. All right. And then you start to probe into something like that and say, well, what interests you in travel? And the person might say, well, it's just fun learning new things. You say, oh, have you had an example of learning new things in the last couple of years? Oh, well, yeah. After school one time on the weekend, I was introduced to XYZ. And there's something in their life that they have done to trigger the interest in going to the Grand Canyon. Something that you can talk about where they will express what they have literally done, for example, to learn new things. So it does take some digging, as you said, Joe, but it's very, very possible to draw it out. And what often happens then is that as they start to trigger memories of, even at a slight level, of doing something that they were drawn to, in this case, learning new things, what happens literally in terms of neurological synapses is that they will start to draw connections to other parts of their memory where they did the same thing. And it's a kind of reawakening to themselves. It's beautiful.
Tess's question ties right into this, and she's asking, and would you like me to read it? You want to?
No, I've got it right here. Hi, this is from Bonnie again. So could you maybe talk about boundaries?
Start the next one, because the next one flows from what you were just talking about, and then we could go back to Bonnie maybe.
Okay, well, why don't you read that one? It's good to hear your voice, Karen.
You bet. So she says, would it hurt to ask what the coachee has been told that they do well? And then, do you enjoy doing it, or do you just enjoy hearing it, or does that take you really down the wrong track with a coachee?
I think it doesn't necessarily ask what other people tell you did well. Not necessarily, but the problem is that it can lead down a path of inauthenticity. And this is one reason why it's very critical to use strengths alongside MCORE, because it's possible for people to have abilities that they do well, and a lot of people tell them that they do well, but they're not really motivated to do. That can happen. And so I think it is possible to have people share what other people say they do well as a way to kind of spark an authentic story. But it's really important for us to qualify that. So if we're getting people to talk about something that other people say they do well, we need to move very quickly into, now, do you enjoy that? And if a person says, well, sort of, then what you want to say is, well, tell me about the parts that you do enjoy doing. Because we are often observers on the outside, and we often don't take the time to enter into the interior space of the other person, which is really the part of the value of empathy. And so we need to know what they're paying attention to, what they're feeling, what they're drawn to, as a way to help them get grounded in what it really is that they're authentically, uniquely gifted to doing. Is that helpful, Tess? I'd like to hear from Tess here, if that's useful. Okay. All right. And then, Karen, could you read that statement from Bonnie about boundaries?
Bonnie says, could you perhaps talk about boundaries in empathy? How, for instance, to discern when a person is ranting, and what to do if someone just reveals their life story? How to keep the relationship professional. Personal, but yet professional. Yeah,
really good. This is one of the reasons why, and it is a beautiful irony, but it's one of the reasons why achievement story is so valuable for this very objective. Because people tend to rant when they're ticked off about something, or they feel like an injustice has been done, or so those kinds of issues, and that can be a waste of time. It's not life-giving to them. It's not life-giving to the coaching mentoring relationship either. And you kind of feel like a doormat if people are just, vomiting a rant, and we're listening to that. So there are times when we don't want to listen to that. And we want to say, is this useful for you to really talk about it, right? Now, but the value of getting people to share achievement story is that there's something about, and I'd love to explore this more in writing and research, but there's something about getting people grounded in an activity that they've authentically loved and done well. And that is that it's usually very, very positive action. Now, sometimes it involves overcoming great difficulty or meeting the challenge of some difficulty, but very, very, very seldom, if I have them start to get into an authentic story, will they start to rant. Because they don't really feel good about ranting, but an achievement story is a story of activity where they've done something generative. They've done something valuable. And when they talk about the details of that action also, they're almost talking about the action itself rather than their own feelings about the action. Now, we do ask what was satisfying about that, what was fulfilling about that, but the emphasis in the achievement story is getting a picture of them in action. And normally that's not the action of ranting. It's the action of something generative and positive. So achievement story is a way, to sum this up, is a way to steer the course towards more of a professional relationship where they kind of keep that stuff at bay a little bit, usually, but then also has the depth of personal engagement. Now, Bonnie, was that helpful? Any follow-up on that? Okay, great. So we're about 10 minutes to the hour. Karen, how much more time do we have?
If there are no more questions, we can break at any point.
Okay. Well, let's just
I wonder
pause.
if when you're dealing with youth, this is a bit of an aside, but if you're dealing with youth, because of exactly what you talked about early on today, about the 40% reduction in their empathy markers for the younger set, if you find that they really go to school on how they're being treated and listened to and loved, and or if you actually take it to the next level, do you ever make a point of that? Do you ever try to educate a little bit in that arena, or just through example?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In the workshop itself, one of the whole objectives of that workshop is to help people, particularly young people, youth and young adults. One of the objectives is not just for them to cultivate their own discernment of personal vocation, but also to set a context where, with their peers, they can do the same for others. And that is, I think, important for a variety of reasons. But the short answer is yes, Karen. One of the activities that I do in this workbook, and I do in a class, I taught a whole class on discerning personal vocation last semester, and I'm going to be doing so this semester as well. And this is one of the most magical, rich class periods, is that I have the youth divide up into pairs, and I have them listen to one another's stories. And the cell phones are turned off and set aside in that class. And try to set a context where they can have this sort of listening to one another. And then what I do is I have them reflect upon the fruit of that. And I'll ask them, I'll say, hey, what did you learn about yourself and others as you were sharing one another's stories, and really trying to reflect back what you heard in the other. And invariably, they'll say, oh, I never knew that about that person, or I saw the person light up in a way I've never seen before. And try to cultivate that listening, that empathic listening in the students, for sure.
Right. Thank you. If you have a question, raise your hand. Otherwise, I think we will thank Joshua for his time today. This was a terrific first of two. Do you have a slide on the second one?
I sure do.
All righty.
All right. So we've been talking about an aspect of this book, Unrepeatable, Cultivating the Unique Calling of Every Person, by listening with empathy to their achievement stories. But the next webinar, which is going to be on July 11th, again at 12 p.m., is going to continue that conversation, but particularly around culture. How do we build a culture of personal vocation in our homes, in our parishes, in our classrooms, in our youth groups? And we'll talk a bit about empathy, but we'll talk about the need to cultivate a culture of wonder, a culture of incarnation, a culture of creativity, as antidotes to a culture of conformity, a culture of disincarnation, and a culture of what we call calculation, where we try to figure things out without wonder, and in a way that's small and controlling. So anyway, that's the next webinar. It's a delight to be with you all. Wish I could see you, but it's been great hearing your voices and engaging you in dialogue. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you all. Hope to see you all back here in a couple weeks. Have a beautiful day.
Bye.